First off, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Carrie Curry. I am the historical coordinator here at the Burwell School Historic Site, and I am so excited that you are with us for this History Spotlight program. Today, we are going to be digging deeper into the lives of two men from Hillsboro natives, Job Berry and Henry Evans. And while their starts in life were quite different, they did share many similar experiences, and our exceptionally distinguished panel today is going to give you guys more in-depth analysis of their lives. So before I introduce our panelists, I just want to let you know the format for today. So Betty Eidenier is going to introduce us to the life of Job Berry. Then Sylvia Hoffert is going to cover the life of Henry Evans. Following that, Brooks Graebner will discuss how the paths of Evans and Berry diverged after they left St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. And then Reg is going to give us some commentary on that. And then at the end of all these presentations, we're going to open it up for questions. I'm sure you guys will have lots to discuss. So at any point in time in the conversation, you can enter a question into the chat. And I believe we also have the Q&A activated. So either one of those is fine. You can enter them at any time, but we're not going to take those questions until the end of the program. So before we get started, I have the honor of introducing you all to our panel. I'm going to start with Miss Betty Eidenier. A lifelong educator. She retired from teaching high school English, but she never stopped sharing her knowledge with the public. She served for many years on the Historic Hillsborough Commission and continues to be an active part of the Research Committee, where she leads various projects, including our recent task force to learn more about the people of color who lived and worked at the Burwell School. In addition to teaching adult classes on local history at Durham Community College, she's been on the board and has served as president of both the Hillsboro Historical Society and the Orange County Historical Museum. She's worked in research for decades with historians, including Rosetta Moore, Doris Wilson, Peter Wood, and Rebecca Faribault Ringer. She received her BA in English from UNCG, her master's in English from Duke, and a certificate in special education from UNC. And Dr. Sylvia Hoffert is our next panelist. She is a distinguished professor emeritus of history and women's studies from UNC Chapel Hill and Texas A&M University. In addition to her teaching career, she is the author of numerous books and is currently working on a fantastic antebellum history of the town of Hillsboro. She continues to speak and publish on topics relating to women's history, particularly in the antebellum era, including the lives of women of color, such as Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley. She is also a member of the Historic Hillsborough Commission, and that is the organization that does own and operate the Burwell School Historic Site. She holds a PhD in American History from Indiana University, Bloomington. Next up, we have the Reverend Dr. Brooks Graebner, who is the current chair of the Historic Hillsborough Commission. He is the Rector Emeritus of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church here in Hillsboro, where he served for 27 years. Since 2007, he has been, and I'm going to pronounce this correctly, hopefully, the historiographer for the Diocese of North Carolina. He holds a doctorate in American Religious Studies from Duke and has taught courses in Episcopal history at both Duke and Wake Forest Divinity Schools. And our final panelist today is Dr. Reginald Hildebrand. He is an associate professor of African American Studies and History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He authored The Times Were Strange and Stirring, Methodist Preachers and the Crisis of Emancipation, and has served as interim director of both the Sonia Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History and the Institute of African American Research at UNC Chapel Hill, as well as an unbelievably long list of other organizations. He received his BA and MA from Howard and his PhD from Princeton. And so with that unbelievably talented cast of individuals, I am going to go ahead and turn the program over to Betty, who is going to introduce us to Job Berry. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. And I want to also thank you, Carrie, and the people at Moorfields and Rick Shaw for help in researching Job Berry. I'm saying Job, J-O-B, like Job in the Bible. It's difficult to say Job Berry without it sounding like his name is Joe, but it's Job, J-O-B. And that was part of my problem, because when I was trying to find out something about Job, I couldn't find anybody in Orange County who was named Job in any of the records, except at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. But when I came to Orange County in 1968, I met a woman who was my coworker and mentor, Mrs. Rebecca Faribault Ringer. And Mrs. Ringer told me that Job Berry was considered in Hillsboro to be one of the most significant people who ever lived here. So why did nobody know about him? Well, Mrs. Ringer said that her grandmother, the famous Peggy Faribault, the midwife, had taught her that Job Berry was the hope of the Black people of Hillsboro before emancipation. So I started searching for Job backwards from the time he was 23, which was the first record of him, which was at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. And there he was, a Black slave named Job, no last name, getting baptized under the sponsorship of one of the most important people in North Carolina, George Burwell. And also getting baptized at the same time was George Burwell's son, the 9-year-old Hill Burwell. So I thought, okay, must be Job belonged to George Burwell. And my guess was that his job for George Burwell was to look after young Hill, because the Burwells actually lived in Wilmington. And they came to Hillsboro when it was hot to get away from mosquitoes. And then in the winter, they went back to their plantation at Castle Hayne, which is just this side of Wilmington, and left their son all alone in Hillsboro in school at the Bingham School. And so I'm thinking maybe they left Joe here also to take care of Hill. So I looked at the New Hanover records, and sure enough, there's a whole bunch of people in New Hanover County named Job. And one of those was a slave who was purchased by Alfred Moore. Well, Alfred Moore owned property in Hillsboro. He owned Moore Fields. And not only that, Alfred Moore was related to George Burwell's wife, Maria Nash. Because looky here, there were two brothers, General Francis Nash, the Revolutionary War hero who was killed in Pennsylvania, and Governor Abner Nash, the second governor of North Carolina. And those two Nashes had beautiful, intelligent daughters. And those daughters married into the Moore family and into the Burwell family. So here it is. Job probably was born in New Hanover County, probably came to Orange County with Alfred Moore, probably was in the Moore family, and therefore given to his daughters, and probably then got to be George Burwell and his wife under their ownership, and then had Hill as his charge. Hill Burwell was a very smart little kid. He finished at the Bingham School very quickly, and at age 16, he went to UNC. So this would have been the time that we know that George Burgwin was in charge of Job. But when Hill went to UNC, Job was out of a job, and therefore Job had to be passed along to somebody else. So Job went to Francis Nash Waddell and his wife, who was another one of those beautiful Moore ladies, and was working for them for a couple of years. But they got into some little financial difficulty. They owed $11,000 to the Bank of Cape Fear. So they decided to sell 26 slaves. And one of those slaves that they sold was Job. The person who bought Job was Stephen Moore. Now, Stephen Moore is, as we say in North Carolina, a whole different set of Moors. Stephen Moore came from Mount Tirzah. His grandfather was the Revolutionary War hero who ice skated from Canada to New York City down the Hudson River, along with 3 Native Americans, to warn the people in New York City about movements in Canada that were going on among the British and the French and the Indians. To get paid, the government gave Stephen Moore's grandfather, Stephen Moore, a postage stamp. And he used that postage stamp to buy Mount Tirzah, which is a story that Tom Magnuson can tell you if you're ever lucky enough to be in his company. So Stephen Moore and his brother left Mount Tirzah, which was in Person County, and came to Hillsboro and set up a mercantile business. And he had the money to buy these 26 slaves, including Job. But times got hard in the mercantile business. So 2 years later, he sold Job, and Job was bought by the best, most influential attorney in the state of North Carolina, Hugh Waddell. And it looked like life was looking up again for Job. So let's go back for a minute. Job was baptized when he was 23 years old at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. He was confirmed the following year by Bishop Ives. The year after that, when probably Job felt that he was being called by God to be a preacher, the state of North Carolina made it illegal for Black people to be preachers, made it illegal for Black people to be educated. But here was Job. He was being called by God. He believed that. His name was biblical. He was in St. Matthew's Episcopal Church with Hill Burgwin, this little boy, every weekend listening to the gospel. Hill was at the Bingham School, the best school in North Carolina for little boys. He was smart. He was getting an education, but it was illegal for Job to get an education. So he was a slave, and he was a slave for important people. And this influenced his life in a good way. Judge Beverly Scarlett says it was much easier for slaves than it was for free Black people because slaves had protection. And here was Job Berry with the protection of the most influential attorney in North Carolina. And he worked for him as his personal servant until 1853. In 1853, Hugh Waddell decided that he would leave Hillsboro and go to Chapel Hill. He sold Twin Chimneys where he lived and left Job on his own. But Job was used to work, and Job had influence in the community. He had worked for John Berry as a painter, because back in the day, slaves didn't have just one thing they did. Slaves were to provide service, but they also were to earn money. And Job worked as a painter for John Berry, and of course, his wages would be paid to whoever owned him at a particular time. One of the things that John Berry did in Hillsboro, North Carolina, was to build what we call now the old courthouse. In 1941, the old courthouse, which was a frame building, was up for sale because the county was going to build this brick courthouse. Guess who came to town? Elias Dodson. Elias Dodson was a coal porter for the Baptist Church. He was an itinerant preacher who sold a biblical recorder. And he got Susan Washington Graham, who was Alexander Graham's wife, to put up some money to buy the corner lot on Tryon and King Street for the Baptist Church. And he got 100 men to come in from the county, and slaves, probably even Job Berry would have helped, to roll the old courthouse building from where it was on King Street up to where it is today on the corner of Tryon and King. And we now call it Dickerson Chapel. It sat there for a few months until they could get John Berry to build a foundation for it. And then the Baptists took it over as their church. So we have Job in town watching this, helping with this, under the influence of Elias Dodson, who wants to start a church and is able to get 100 people to help him move this building to start a church. So what else happened that year? That year, Job Berry left St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. We don't know why, but we think maybe it was because that's when Hilbert Gwynn was no longer under his charge. He had been sold twice. He was seeing this man who started a Baptist church, and maybe he had other things that God was calling him to do. So he continued to paint. He continued to be Hugh Waddell's personal servant. And he worked in the community as the hope of the Black people, doing weddings, doing funerals, doing welcome into the community of the Lord for the Black people in Hillsboro. But he had no credentials. It was illegal. But Hugh Waddell let him do it. Hugh Waddell was so important, nobody was going to question what Job Berry was doing in the community, what Job was doing. He wasn't yet Berry. Then Hugh Waddell left Hillsboro and Job stayed. Why did he stay? He didn't go with Hugh Waddell. He stayed because he had gotten married. He had married a woman named Rebecca, who worked for the Nash sisters and Frederick Nash, who were the children of that other person, Abner Nash, the old governor of North Carolina, another influential family. And he and Rebecca lived behind the Nash household in a slave house, and they began a family. In the next 20 years, they had 8 children. During this time, Job is still a slave. Rebecca is a slave. They are working for the Nash family. They are working for John Berry. And that continued until 1865, Emancipation. Now, Job got to choose a name at an Emancipation, and he chose the name of Berry. He didn't choose Nash, he didn't choose Burgwin, he didn't choose Moore, he didn't choose Waddell. He chose Berry because he respected John Berry. John Berry treated Black people well. And if Black people worked well for him and he owned them, he gave them their freedom. He didn't own Job, but now Job had his freedom and he chose the name Berry. And one of the first things that he did was to make sure that all those people that he had married, who were by the county called cohabiting, were able to get marriage licenses when the Freedmen's Bureau came and set up. He also determined that those children were going to have a school. And in 1865, he proposed, it was in the newspaper, a fair. And anybody that wanted to support getting a school for Hillsboro, Black children and Black adults who never had been able to learn to read and write, should come to the fair. It was a joke for some of the white people. Even Miss Nash wrote in a letter that all the Black people from the country were bringing the food to the fair and all the Black people from town were eating it. But he raised the money. And who knows who else gave him money? Hugh Waddell might have given him some money. They got enough to purchase the Dickerson Chapel church that used to be the Baptist church from the Baptist, because the Baptists were building a new church. How did he know to do that? Well, he paid attention to Elias Dodson. They set up a church. And then they got the Philadelphia Friends, the Quakers, to come with 3 teachers to start the school in the church. And things were going well for them. They had a school, they had a church. In 1867, there was a convention of the AME church, and Job Berry became officially a preacher. He was given churches in other parts of Orange County, and he continued in Hillsboro to support his friend Reverend Billy Payne and others at Dickerson Chapel. In the 1870s, the white people in Hillsboro got worried about this school and this church. In the 1870s, it was not pretty in Hillsboro. In the newspaper was a warning printed. Hey, these Black families are supporting education more than the white families are. In the 1870s, there were hangings in Hillsboro of white people hanging Black people. In the 1870s, the Republicans who were supporting Governor Caldwell and later W.W. Holden invited Job Berry to be an Orange County representative to the state Republican convention. There were important people on that same committee, like Solomon Poole, the president of the University of North Carolina. They were on the wrong side. They didn't achieve power. They supported U.S. Grant and W.W. Holden and Caldwell, but time ran out for them. And sometime between 1872 and 1884, Job Berry died. And he didn't get to see what he had done, but we know what he had done. He had started a school. He had a Black community that was able to work together. And he had those 8 children who continued with their families to do things. Richard Berry lived in Hillsboro. He was a painter like his dad. He had a son that he named Lisbon in honor of his brother Lisbon. And Lisbon had a son named Lisbon. And those 2 Lisbons both became attorneys, first doing insurance in North Carolina, the younger one becoming a civil rights lawyer in Durham and in Washington, D.C. Lisbon Berry, who was the second son, went to school, to college at Biddle Institute, which now is Johnson C. Smith. It was an institute for Black people to become preachers, which is what he did. And he returned eventually to Hillsboro and was here probably taking care of his dad and helping out also at St. Matthew's. And then there was a son named Joe who stayed in Hillsboro, who was a painter, and then 5 daughters. All 5 of those daughters became teachers, and they married into the Whitted family and into the Rencher family, and their children became leaders in the Black community in Hillsboro and in Hillsboro and Orange County, because we still have a racial divide, a terrible racial divide. But this family was strong and daring, go-getters, risk takers, and they made a huge, huge influence in the community. Okay, Sylvia, on to you.
Can everybody hear me? Yes? No?
Yes.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Betty. I'm going to talk about a free Black man in Hillsboro. Just to sort of set the stage, I want to give you some figures, which is to say that free Blacks never comprised a very large segment of the South's Black population. By 1860, they only amounted to about 250,000 free Blacks out of 4 million slaves. So this is, in terms of the South as a whole, this is a very small population. In 1850 in Hillsboro, there may have been as many as 20 households, but again, it's hard to tell because the census doesn't distinguish about who lived in Hillsboro and who lived outside of Hillsboro. So just know that this is a very small community of free Blacks who are living in Hillsboro. Also know that they were extremely unpopular among whites. They were the thorn in the side of white Southerners for more than one reason. Number one, many of them were mulattoes, and the presence of mulattoes served as a constant reminder of the problem of miscegenation from the white point of view. So they're evidence of miscegenation that's sort of, they are seen day after day after day. The second thing is that whites assumed that free Blacks were in cahoots with the slaves who wanted to be free. And so they were considered subversive. So there's great hostility on the part of whites towards free Blacks. The idea was you had to keep them under control, and if you could get rid of them, that would be a good idea too. So just keep that background in mind when I tell you the story of Henry Evans. His mother was named Fannie Evans. She was unmarried, she was free, and she was mulatto. She was born around 1785 and arrived in Hillsboro sometime between 1810 and 1820. She's in the 1820 census. She had 4 children. Delilah, who was born in 1809, whose father is unknown. Then Henry was born in 1817. Jane was born before 1822, and Wilson Bruce was born in 1824. All 3 were probably the children of John Wilson, who was a slave-owning planter in Caswell County, North Carolina. And we can assume that that's true because on May 1st, 1822, 2 years before Wilson was born, so he's not going to be included in this, John Wilson registered a deed transferring one half of a town lot in Hillsboro on the corner of Hazel and Margaret Lane to Jane and Henry Evans, quote, for and in consideration of the natural love and affection he felt for them, and provided that Fannie, their mother, should have the use of the property during her lifetime. It's unclear how Fannie supported herself. John Wilson may have given her the money to live in Hillsboro, but as a free woman, she had the right to sign contracts. So she could contract her labor out as she wished. to do a wide variety of probably domestic work. She also owned property, so she could have run a boarding house. We have no idea if she did that or not, but it was possible. What we do know is that she apprenticed her oldest son, Henry, to a cabinet maker in order to learn a trade. Now, historians disagree on the role of apprenticeship among the Black population. John Hope Franklin characterized it as the primary educational institution for freeborn children of color in the early 19th century. Basically, apprenticeship was an agreement either between a master craftsman and either the parent or the county. It provided, it was a contract, so it set the terms of the apprenticeship. Often the master provided food, clothing, shelter, depending on what period, the early period, to the ability to read and write, and some skill, and it was for a specific period of time. So John Hope Franklin said, this is how Blacks got educated. Ira Berlin, on the other hand, looked upon apprenticeships as, quote, labor extortion, unquote. It was simply another means of locking free Negroes into virtual slavery. So there's a disagreement there. It's unclear where and under whose supervision Henry learned to become a cabinet maker. Thomas Day had been in Hillsboro, but he was long gone. So someone who was a cabinet maker trained this young man in this profession. He had to teach him a lot of skills. First of all, he had to teach him all about wood, the kinds of wood, its characteristics, and how to turn wood into furniture. But he also had to teach him business skills, such as estimating the cost of making a piece of furniture, keeping a set of books, drawing up invoices, keeping track of his debts and the money his customers owed him, and his apprenticeship would have introduced him to potential patrons, and most of all, or perhaps as important, allowed him to observe and master the rules of racial etiquette, which would provide him the entree into doing business in Hillsboro. As you can tell, all of this necessitated his being able to read, write, and at least do cipher, to do basic arithmetic. On August 24th, 1838, he purchased a piece of prime real estate from William E. Anderson for $265. That amounts to about $6,500 in today's money. Where this young free Black man got about $6,500 to buy this property is unclear. His father, John Wilson, could have given him the money. He could have borrowed against his property. He couldn't sell the property because his mother had a lifetime interest in it and she wasn't dead yet. But he could have borrowed money from someone, or some other white man who had money and willing to invest in an ambitious young Black man could have loaned him the money or given him the money or whatever. But in any case, he set up his business on Churton Street. He probably apprenticed his brother, Wilson, to learn to make furniture. And the Hillsboro Recorder and ads are really interesting and gives us a real sense of what he was doing. One ad appearing in the late 1830s said, he repaired and revarnished old furniture and produced sofas, sideboards, bureaus, and tables of the finest quality, as well as pieces made of inexpensive wood, stained to look like mahogany, rosewood, or satinwood. In 1848, he expanded his business to transportation and placed an ad saying that he had a comfortable carriage, a hack, and a buggy, and good horses to provide transportation services for the citizens of Hillsboro. His ads declared that he had an experienced driver on call to convey passengers to and from town. And in 1850, he expanded his business one more time to begin an undertaking business, advertising a boast that he could construct a coffin in only 3 hours. You have to keep in mind that speed was important because embalming had not was not being widely used, and so preparing a coffin was really important if you could do it fast. One of the things he seems to have been really concerned about is respectability. In the early 19th century, respectability was based on a number of characteristics, one of which was to show that you were a responsible family man. So in 1843, he married Henrietta Leary. She was the daughter of Matthew Leary, a free mulatto saddler who lived in Fayetteville. And soon thereafter, they began having their family. Lizzie was born in 1844. Julia was born in 1846. Matthew was born in 1848. And Sarah was born in 1849. The second thing you could do to make sure that people understood that you were respectable was to join a church. And so he joined the St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. Moses Ashley Curtis baptized Henry on August 28th, 1842. And on the same day, Bishop Ives confirmed him as a member of St. Matthew's. Now, affiliation with St. Matthew's meant something very specific to a family like the Evanses. First of all, it provided them with a spiritual home. Secondly, it confirmed their equality in the eyes of God. Thirdly, it was evidence of their respectability. And fourthly, it was an opportunity to associate with some of Hillsboro's most prominent families, who of course could serve as Henry's potential customers. Sometime in the early 1850s, both the Evans brothers became dissatisfied with their situation in Hillsboro. We have absolutely no idea why. We don't know if something important happened or it was just a series of little insults, being called a boy too often, someone refusing a handshake. It could have been a number of things, probably that combined together to make them really unhappy. So they began to think about alternative places to live. And in the 1840s, their eldest sister, Delilah, had moved to Oberlin, Ohio, with her husband. Now, her story is important here. Delilah was 8 years older than Henry. In August 1831, she married a former slave named John Copeland, who was a carpenter who worked in Raleigh. So this couple lived in Raleigh. At the time, however, she married, race relations in North Carolina became very fraught. As most of you know, Nat Turner's rebellion occurred in Virginia in August of 1831. In 1835, the North Carolina new Constitution deprived free Black men like John Copeland of the right to vote. The Panic of 1837 disrupted the conduct of business and access to credit. And what that meant was that Black laborers, white laborers became very sensitive about the competition that Black laborers posed to them. And about that time, Raleigh also, as a city, required free Blacks to buy a residency permit. So things were not going well for the Copelands in Raleigh. But the thing that pushed them out was that in October 1842, one of the Copeland's friends, a man named Allen Jones, was dragged from his house in Raleigh and whipped by a white mob. Jones was a free mulatto blacksmith who had managed to purchase himself and his wife and some of them children. And if you look at the census, he had slaves living in his household. So he was in the process of buying these slaves and setting them free. The Copelands and the Joneses, along with a man named John Lane, left Raleigh and left North Carolina. They packed up, headed north to Ohio to find a new home. They eventually ended up in a place called New Richmond, Ohio, which is on the Ohio River. It's a terminal for steamboat traffic on the river. And it was a center of abolitionist sympathies. So at some point after their arrival in New Richmond, they went to an abolitionist meeting and met a man who was important in the abolitionist movement called Amos Dresser. He had gone to school in Oberlin, Ohio, and he encouraged them to go up there. It was some distance, but to move from New Richmond to Oberlin, which they did. John established himself as a carpenter and Allen worked as a blacksmith. And they no doubt sent letters back to their two brothers here in Hillsboro, talking about how much better their lives were in Ohio. So the Evans brothers decided to join them. Wilson married Henrietta's sister, Sarah Jane Leary, in May of 1853, and Henry began selling all of his assets in Hillsboro. Thomas and James Webb bought the property of his store where he lived above, he and his family lived above the store for $479, which amounts to about $15,000 in today's money. And by New Year's Day, 1854, they were ready to leave. The problem was, however, they had to get from North Carolina to Ohio, and depending on what route they took, they had to go through slave states. At any point during that trip, they could have been stopped by patrols. They could have been harassed. A lot of bad things could have happened to them on that trip through either Virginia, Tennessee, or Kentucky. And so they decided that they needed to get a pass that would persuade anybody on the route that they were legitimate and that they were not going to stay in their state. Slave states did not like blacks coming in. So they had to make sure that they had a document that said that they should be allowed to go through, but they weren't going to stay. So they actually got three important businessmen, two in Fayetteville and John Kirkland of Hillsboro, to write to the governor to get the passes they needed to make their way through those slave states. And I would just want to read you what one of those letters said. The two men from Fayetteville were John H. Cook, who was a wealthy merchant, and Alfred McKeithen, who was a coach manufacturer. And they wrote to the governor from Fayetteville saying, the bearer, Henry Evans, a free man of color, his wife and children, are about to emigrate to Ohio and desire to make arrangements to pass by public conveyance from the southern states without interruption. He is accompanied by his brother and brother-in-law, himself and brother married in our place in a family of as much respectability as any colored family in the state. And we are pleased to say that the party are entitled to as much respect and regard as any colored family in our state. Any manner in which you can facilitate their easy passage will be appreciated and will be acknowledged and reciprocated by your obedient servant, John H. Cook and A.A. McKeithen. John Kirkland's letter said essentially the same thing. And apparently they got the passes they needed because they eventually arrived in Oberlin, Ohio to join Delilah and her husband and family. Now, what was going on in Ohio at this time? So this is 1854. 4 years before, Congress had passed the Compromise of 1850, which included a fugitive slave law that made it much easier for Southern slave owners to retrieve runaway slaves from the North who were headed to Canada. There were many Northern states that tried to interfere with the enforcement of that fugitive slave law by passing what were called personal liberty laws. All they did was to put all kinds of legal barriers between a slave catcher or an owner and trying to get legal custody of a slave so that they could take him back south. Unfortunately, in Ohio in 1858, the Democrats got a hold of the state legislature and they repealed the Ohio personal liberty law. And so any runaway slave that found him or herself in Ohio were liable to be taken by slave catchers or owners and returned to the South. Now, the other issue is that slave catchers didn't always catch slaves. If they wanted to make a lot of money, they would pick up and imprison or take custody of free blacks and take them back down south and sell them into slavery. So the abolitionist sympathizers in Ohio were outraged by this. And in the early spring of 1858, John Price, a runaway slave from Kentucky, arrived in Oberlin to take refuge. He lived there for a few months before two Kentucky slave catchers spotted him, took him into custody, and took him to the nearby town of Wellington, where they took him to a hotel and were awaiting the arrival of a train south so they could return him to his owners in Kentucky. Some students and Oberlin students and some Oberlin citizens, including Henry Wilson, their nephew, John Copeland Jr., and their brother-in-law, Louis Sheridan Leary, intervened. They all flocked to Wellington. They attacked the hotel. They took John Price into custody and put him on the Underground Railroad and sent him up to Canada. For those actions, they were arrested for what was called the Oberlin-Wellington Rescue. And they were imprisoned for a few months, but the charges were eventually dropped. But the abolitionist sympathy in that family continued. On October the 16th, 1859, John Copeland Jr. and Lewis Sheridan Leary, the brother-in-law and the nephew, participated in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Neither of them survived. Leary died of gunshot wounds, and Copeland was hanged for treason on December 16th, 1859. The war, of course, Civil War starts in 1861. Henry was too old to fight in the Civil War, but during the war, he expanded his undertaking business, and by 1870, he had accumulated $2,200 worth of real estate, which amounts to about $45,687. He died in 1886 at the age of 69. Wilson did enlist in August of 1864 and served as a private in the 178th Infantry. He mustered out in 1865 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and made his way back to Oberlin, resumed his work as a furniture maker, and died in 1898. So at this point, I will turn you over to Brooks, who will talk about these two men and their spiritual journey.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Great. As Betty and Sylvia have demonstrated, both Job Berry and Henry Evans were remarkable individuals, well deserving of the spotlight we're shining on them today. This afternoon, I'd like to take as my starting point the fact that both Job Berry and Henry Evans had this too in common. They were communicants of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church here in Hillsboro during the antebellum period. But from there, their stories diverge in significant ways. Job Berry would make his way from St. Matthew's to become one of the founders and early pastors of the African Methodist Episcopal congregation. Henry Evans would make his way to Oberlin, Ohio, and become one of the founding members of the Second Congregational Church in Oberlin. I'd like to trace what we know of their respective religious pilgrimages, what might have impelled them to make the journeys they did, and to suggest how their stories are reflective of important aspects of the larger story of religion and race in America. Let's begin with Job Berry. Berry came to Hillsboro at age 23 as an enslaved member of the Bergwin family. On October 6th, of 1833, he was baptized at St. Matthew's alongside 8-year-old Hill Bergwin. Thus, Job Berry's baptism reflected his position in the Bergwin family. It was not uncommon for slaveholding families to incorporate those who personally attended to them into their domestic religious life. But Job Berry then took a further step. In April of 1834, he became a communicant of the Episcopal Church and an adult member of St. Matthew's through the rite of confirmation. This act has several important significations. First, it reflects the commitment to slave evangelization of St. Matthew's rector, William Mercer Green. Green actually spent a considerable amount of his ministry in this effort, often devoting Saturdays and Sunday afternoons to preaching and teaching Blacks. Secondly, being confirmed meant that Job Berry would have learned from Green's tutelage the basic tenets of the faith as contained in the Catechism. He would have been taught and most likely made to recite the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the Ten Commandments. And of course, he would have gone to church regularly and familiarized himself with the Bible and the prayer book. So, and this is my final point. So Job Berry was adopting the religious attitudes and practices of Episcopalians and could make himself at home in St. Matthew's and among her predominantly white members. But there would have been limits placed on his participation. While the Episcopal Church taught sacramental equality, it did not welcome Blacks into positions of leadership, especially as clergy. And the rare Black Episcopalian who did become a deacon or a priest was only allowed to minister to fellow Blacks and never to whites. But Job Berry evidently had a call to preach. We know that after 1842, he left St. Matthew's. What we don't know is exactly what came next. Anecdotal evidence suggests that by the 1850s, he had gathered around him a congregation of Hillsboro Blacks and was exercising informal leadership as their preacher. That view is strengthened by what we do know with certainty. Within months of the South surrender, Job Berry was spearheading efforts on behalf of the Black citizens of Hillsboro to build a school for the newly emancipated. Berry could not have done that unless he already had a position of leadership and respect, as Betty has underscored for us. Then comes the formal validation of his call to preach and lead when in April 1867, he's licensed by the South Carolina Conference of the AME Church. Given Job Berry's commitment to the education of the newly emancipated, his embrace of the AME denomination, and their acceptance of him makes perfect sense. The AME denomination, even before it was allowed to enter the Southern mission field, had made education a hallmark of its identity. Being the first Black denomination to own and operate a college, Wilberforce College in Xenia, Ohio. Indeed, we see the establishment of AME congregations alongside freedmen schools in many Southern communities, including Chapel Hill. Had Berry sought ordination in the Episcopal Church after the Civil War, he would almost certainly have been rebuffed. As Anna Julia Cooper lamented in the 1880s, our, that is, Episcopal clergy, number less than 24 priests of Negro blood in the entire Southland, while the organization known as the AME Church has 14,000 ministers, 4,000 self-supporting churches with property valued at over $7 million, raising yearly for church purposes $1,427,000. But that does not mean that Berry was shunned by the clergy and members of the church he once called home. In 1873, the records of St. Matthew's note that Job Berry officiated at a baptism alongside Charles Curtis. However attenuated, however seldom, Hillsboro still afforded occasions for biracial ministry and collegiality. Now let's turn to Henry Evans. At the age of 25, he joined St. Matthew's, being baptized and confirmed on August 28th of 1842. The reasons he sought membership are unknown, but this much is clear: it was his decision and his alone. We see no evidence that other members of his family belonged to the church. Evans himself clearly regarded it as an important moment, a time of spiritual or religious awakening in his life. He would declare in 1859, looking back on this decision, "For 18 years, I have been seeking to know what the Lord would have me do in my humble position in life." In any event, he remained a member of for 12 years until he left for Ohio in 1854. Once in Ohio, the Evans family migrated to Oberlin. Henry and his brother Wilson set up a furniture and coffin making business and built a house. Oberlin was the center of anti-slavery activity, and this included the local Congregational Church, which had close links to the college. The Reverend Charles Grandison Finney was in charge of both. For some years, it was the only church in town. But in April of 1855, shortly after Evans' arrival, steps were taken to form an Episcopal congregation, Christ Church. So here's the question. Did Evans remain an Episcopalian, or did he affiliate with the prevailing religious ethos of Oberlin and associate with the Congregational Church? The answer is fascinating. Although Evans was not among the subscribers to the founding documents of Christ Church, he did subsequently join the church and was elected to the vestry in February of 1856. He was still a member of the vestry over 2 years later in April of 1858, when the priest serving in Oberlin submitted his resignation and the vestry members, including Henry Evans, accepted it. But when the parish gathered for a meeting later in the year, on December 13th of 1858, the vestry no longer had a quorum of members. Because of resignations and removals, the vestry had been reduced to 3 members, and a called meeting of the parish was necessary to elect a new vestry to conduct the business of the parish. The 3 continuing members of the vestry did not include Henry Evans, so he must have been among those who had resigned by December of 1858. So what happened to account for that action? Historians of Oberlin generally regard Christ Church as a haven for Democrats and those in town who did not share the prevailing anti-slavery fervor of the college and the congregation. Initially, Evans seems to have been comfortable in that environment. After all, he'd sat in the pews of St. Matthew's alongside Paul Cameron and Thomas Ruffin. But in early December 1858, Evans was among those charged with violating the fugitive slave law for taking part in the Oberlin-Wellington rescue of John Price. And the deputy marshal responsible for bringing charges against the rescuers was none other than Evans' fellow vestry member, Anson Dayton. Whether in direct response to Dayton's actions in charging him, or in simply seeking to avoid the contentious climate at Christ Church, Evans, and actually Dayton also for that matter, were no longer affiliated with the congregation by December 13th. Evans and his fellow rescuers spent the first 6 months of 1859 in jail in Cleveland. In the end, only 2 of them were convicted and the rest allowed to go free. Speaking at the time of his release, Evans saw the entire experience through the lens of his faith. Viewing the ordeal as divinely directed, he declared, "When I was cast into prison, my heart again said, 'Let thy will, not mine, be done.' I need not tell you, my friends, that to suffer for humanity's sake has been to me a pleasure and not a pain. My soul had entered into the work that God had called me to accomplish." A man of evident devotion and deep faith, the question was this: would Evans, having left the Episcopal Church, now join another? The answer is found in the minutes of First Congregational Church Oberlin, where we read that Henry Evans joined the church on his profession on March 4th, 1860. But he remained on the rolls of First Church for only a few weeks before transferring his membership to the newly forming Second Congregational Church in Oberlin. Indeed, the timing suggests that Evans' decision to join First Church in the spring of 1860 was precisely so that he could be involved in the formation of Second Congregational Church in May of 1860. In the first published manual of Second Church, we see that Evans' name appears on the first list of members. What particular role, if any, he played in the life of the new congregation is not documented. But the question of why he would seek to affiliate with this church can be answered in part by looking at the official position of the church with respect to the great moral issues. And I'm going to read to you that resolution. Resolution of the Second Congregational Church on important moral questions. Resolved that we regard the holding of our fellow men as chattels, a sin against God as well as against man, and we therefore refuse Christian fellowship to slaveholders and to those who justify or defend slavery. So the church records are clear. Henry Evans was a confirmed member of St. Matthew's from 1842 to 1854, a communicant and a vestry member of Christ Church Oberlin from 1856 to 1858, a founding member of Second Congregational Church from 1860 until his death. Hidden from our view were the autobiographical details which would tell us what particular experiences and convictions impelled his decision to join these churches. But this much is clear. Evans thought of himself as an Episcopalian while resident in Hillsboro and when he moved to Oberlin. He sought communicant membership as a young man, not having been brought up in a religious home and not having been baptized as a child. He actively participated in the leadership of Christ Church alongside prominent and conservative white members, just as he once sat in a pew at St. Matthew's and received communion alongside Ruffins and Camerons. But 1858 was a watershed year in his life. His participation in the Oberlin-Wellington rescue and its repercussions define his place in history. For him personally, it also confirmed his place in the unfolding drama of sacred history, suffering for the sake of the gospel. Given what we know about his determination and his family's determination to put their lives on the line for the cause of abolition, it only makes sense that Evans would journey to a Christian community unapologetically anti-slavery. Thank you. And now let me turn this over to Reg Hildebrand.
Well, Brooks and Sylvia and Betty and all those watching, I have to confess at the outset that I am dealing with technical problems far beyond my ability to comprehend and even further beyond my ability to deal with. And Carrie is helping me with this. I hope you can hear me. There may come a time when a battery will die and you will no longer be able to hear me, and I will drop out of the discussion and you'll go on to questions and answers. But it's not from any lack of wanting to be engaged through all of this. I hope that you can hear me thus far. It has been a fascinating privilege for me to be able to go along for the ride and to eavesdrop as three distinguished scholars went about their work. And from my perspective, as you have already heard, they are discovering things cutting edge as they're going about this. In fact, there was information being found during the week as people were completing their remarks, and I got a chance to see them find these things and incorporate them into their remarks today. And so it's been an exciting process. We have the stories, three perspectives on very interesting and complex stories of one enslaved person and one free. They were 7 years apart in age. What they had in common was Hillsboro and St. Matthew's Church. They also had in common pursuit of freedom and being inspired by and moved by a theology, or moved by and toward a theology of freedom. All of these remarks that we've heard provide great new information about these individuals. And they also raise intriguing questions that are beyond the documents that were available as these scholars were doing their research, and that are beyond the parameters of this panel today. But we hope that in the future, as they continue the work, they will find these answers and find some way to share them with us, either in print or online. Very quickly, let me just touch base on these three excellent presentations. On Betty's one on Job. It's striking that this begins with his earliest record being that at St. Matthew's at the church, him being baptized at the age of 20, along with a 9-year-old boy. It's interesting about how that might have happened, or what it might have looked like, and why that happened together in the way that it did. In 1841, she mentioned he was sold for $755, Betty tells us, to William and Susan Waddell. At the time that he was acquired by the Waddells, they had a 7-year-old boy who was named after his grandfather, who was Justice Alfred Moore. And this 7-year-old boy was Alfred Moore Waddell, who in May of 1895 gave one of the speeches dedicating the new Confederate monument on the grounds of the Capitol in Raleigh. And 3 years later, he helped organize, instigate, and lead attack on the city government in Wilmington and the rampage against the Black community there. An interesting connection. One of the things I found interesting about Betty's report was just the life of Job Berry. Married at 36 to a woman 13 years his junior, had 8 children over 20 years. The last was born when he was 57 in 1867. The other striking thing that she mentions is that in 1853, his master left and he remained and went to Chapel Hill while he remained in Hillsboro. And how does that work? How can you be a slave when your master lives in another town? There was a practice called de facto manumission, when a master would allow someone who was still technically a slave to live as if they were a free person. And that's exactly what has happened here. During those times, he is a painter, and Betty explained how it is that he chose the name Berry. Both of his names are interesting and intriguing. Think about naming a child Job and what that might imply, of what you think the child might have to go through or deal with, or the kind of stamina that he would have to have. And it's an assertion of something that he chose, not the name of Waddell or Bergwin, but this man Berry instead. That says something about his relationship to those people, his master, people who had owned him, as well as the free man who treated him apparently with respect. Moving on quickly, those starting a school was helped with the Quakers, which also happened in Chapel Hill, exactly the same kind of setup. Starting an AME church, I have a very quick quote here I'll give you from the AME Christian Recorder about the church in Chapel Hill. The Bishop Alexander Wayman was visiting the area in 1868, the year after Berry became a licensed preacher, and it says this. These are the bishop's words. Leaving Chapel Hill on Thursday morning, I had a pleasant ride in a 2-mule team to Hillsboro, where Reverend Henry Polk is stationed. This is a fine hilly place and has a good church and congregation with a membership of 200. That was at a time when the membership in Chapel Hill was 100. On to Henry Evans, born free of a free mother, with this man, John Wilson, being, as Sylvia has pointed out, his most probably his father. And striking, in 1822, transfers a deed of property to Henry, who at the time was 5, and his sister, who had just been born, transferred the deed to them, and giving their mother the right to use the property as long as she lived. But it's striking. I'm not even sure the legality of that, of transferring property to minors and infant, but something powerful was going on, as Sylvia suggested. And this man, as a businessman, apprentice, becomes a cabinet maker, purchases land when he's 21. She's just 21 when he buys this piece of land, becomes a carpenter, furniture maker, and restorer, has a transportation business, a coffin maker, an undertaker. He is very successful. He is a go-getter. He's winning in the stakes that were available to free blacks. Marries after he is baptized at the church, has 4 children. So he's living a very good life in relative terms. So he gives up a great deal when he decides to go to Ohio. And what Sylvia mentioned that was intriguing was something very important must have been deteriorating. And that was the case in terms of the status of free blacks. And that was the case in much of the South during the decade, and particularly the few years before the Civil War. And that might have impelled him to move out and go to Ohio and start over again. He gave up a great deal quickly, moving on to Brooks's well-crafted essay on divergent pilgrimages, what he tells us. And it's so true that faith was important, both of these men. And they gave up faith, the Episcopal faith, that was traditional for them, a tradition for them, familiar to them, gave them respectability, and chose instead an unsettling and risky theology of freedom. That is, for Evans, going into the abolitionist congregational church, pro-abolition congregational church, founding an independent black church there in Ohio, even though, and it's striking, that he was a part of the vestry of the Episcopal Church, to strike out on something new. That relationship, him as a vestryman, is intriguing in itself. And for Berry, helping found an AME church, and the AME church during this period was known for its gospel of freedom. And what is striking, and a question that might be explored in some future study, would be the interaction that both of these men had with the Black community. That is, their social interactions and their religious interactions with Black people in the community. How did that shape their thinking socially and religiously as they developed? It was clear that after 1853, Job Berry was acting as a minister without ordination within the Black community because it was illegal for him to have been ordained. And he did all of those things and developed a relationship. It would be interesting to know more about how that operated. And I think I will stop here and we can go to questions and answers.
Great, thank you so much. Give me 1 second and let me get everybody back on. And I will open it up at this point for our participants. If you have questions for our panelists, go ahead and put those in the chat. There we go. All right. And just to get us started, I have a question about, do we know, I found it interesting, Brooks, when you were reading the comment about the proclamation, I can't remember the exact term, but what the Second Congregationalist Church said about their take on slavery. And do we know, was there any type of commentary here in Hillsboro regarding that, that may have influenced the experience of Evans and Berry, particularly Berry with leaving the church when he did, the Episcopal Church?
Thank you, Carrie. And thank you to my fellow panelists. This has been really, really wonderful to be part of this afternoon, and what a privilege for me. The Episcopal Church as a denomination, North and South, never took a definite position on the institution of slavery, and never would say that the owning of slaves and Christian profession were incompatible. Now, there were certainly Episcopalians who believed that, but that was never the official position of the church. And so that's why I find it interesting that for Evans, who as soon as he got to Oberlin was immediately in the environment of an explicitly pro-abolitionist religious milieu, did not immediately gravitate to that, but made his pilgrimage through Christ Episcopal Church, where he was accepted onto the vestry. And it's only after the Oberlin-Wellington rescue that he rejects the Episcopal Church and embraces a church, which, as I said, is, unapologetically clear that you cannot countenance slaveholding within a Christian community. Now, that was a position that other denominations had split over, North and South. Methodists had split, Baptists split, Presbyterians split on that issue, but Episcopalians did not. So I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, we have a question here. Could you speak to Job Berry and Henry Evans and whether they were able to have access to education, to reading and writing? And are there any written records known that they left behind?
I'll talk about Henry Evans. He could not have run a business without being able to read, write, and do basic mathematics. So at some point, he learned those skills.
Right.
And for Job Berry, there is no record of his ever learning to read and write, but I believe he could read and write because he read the Bible, he could preach from the Bible, and also as the caretaker, it is my theory, for young Hildebrand, who was a very smart kid, he probably learned along with Bergwijn as he was learning. That very often happened in children teaching enslaved people to read and write.
Another question we have, do we know how Berry and Evans were connected to other Black members, enslaved members of St. Matthew's in the 1830s and 1840s? For instance, connection to slaves owned by Ruffin and Cameron.
I have no information.
I don't have the specific information, but I can say that Hillsboro is a small town and everybody knew everybody. And so I think that we can assume that Job Berry was well liked, well respected, well known, that meant that he knew other people. We know that Mrs. Burwell said that Job Berry and another slave named Peter that did not belong to her were hired by her to plant potatoes at the Burwell School. And so we know that Job Berry worked alongside Peter. He also worked alongside the enslaved and free people that John Berry employed. So I think that it was a pretty wide net. But let's look at Job Berry's wife, Rebecca, that I want Sylvia to get on and find out more about if she can eventually. Rebecca worked for the Nash family, those ladies that established the Nash College School. And Rebecca continued to work for the Nash family after she was married, and they were living right behind the school. Her son, Lisbon, also worked at the Nash College School. And it is my belief, because when Mariah Nash died, Lisbon said she was a saint in a letter that he wrote to the family. It is my belief that Mariah Nash was the one that paid for Lisbon Berry to go to the Biddle Institute to get his college degree and become a preacher. So I think that they were well-known, white and black, but I am sure, according to Mrs. Ringer, that Peggy Faribault was correct, that Job Berry had the respect of all the black community in Hillsboro.
Right.
I just have something I want to add to that, which is to say that it was difficult for free blacks to, their position meant that because they were so distrusted, and because whites expected them to be in cahoots, collaboration with slaves, it was in their best interests. Some of them would have considered it in their best interest not to have close association with people who were enslaved, particularly if you were a businessman and you're in Hillsboro and your customers were all white. So it's really hard to tell, whether Henry Evans and his brother had any close relationships with the enslaved population. They would have known that it was not in their best interest to pursue those relationships, but it's hard to imagine, as you point out, it's a very small town. It's hard to imagine that, that they didn't have those relationships. But this whole thing about racial etiquette was something that really controlled their ability to embrace their enslaved, fellow people living in Hillsboro.
And if I may add, it was a time when many black people pretended that they didn't know things that they knew.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that they could read and write, even if they said on the census or at other times, free and or not, that they could not read or write, because there was a complaint among the Hillsboro white men that people in the North, particularly the newspapers in New York City, were sending newspapers to citizens, black citizens in Hillsboro, through the US mail. And what a horrendous scandal that was. And they wrote a letter to the New York newspapers saying, stop sending subscription newspapers to Hillsboro, North Carolina.
Interesting.
Could I also add what has just been said makes even more striking Evans' experience in Ohio when he joins the Episcopal Church, which was the alternative to the anti-slavery churches that were present. He's making as a black person, he's making a profound statement, not just to whatever blacks were in the community, but to white abolitionists when he joins that church and becomes a vestry person there. So the break that comes after the Oberlin-Wellington incident must have been really profound and striking for him to leave that, which he had sacrificed in some things, parts of his identity, or as part of the black community or even the abolitionist community, to be part of the Episcopal Church, and then decides to become a Congregationalist. There's the complexity that we've been talking about comes across right there very profoundly.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a very insightful comment, Reg. And again, all of this underscores the way in which the fugitive slave law radicalized the North.
Yeah.
Right. I just want to ask, there's two more questions we want to get to, but just a little bit of a follow-up on that question. Sylvia, you had mentioned that it would not have been in Evans' best interest to build those relationships with the enslaved members of the Hillsboro community. would there have been a reciprocal where enslaved members of the community, because of that racial etiquette that you mentioned, would have avoided forming relationships with free people of color because of the threat of uprising from that?
My response is that my gut, historians shouldn't have guts. Just go with the evidence. My gut is that there were those relationships, but blacks were really good at hiding things from whites. So my gut tells me that small town, all these people knew each other. They knew what was going on, but it wasn't in their best interest to flaunt. So I would you agree, Reg? I mean, these people were friends.
Right.
Yeah. But it wasn't in their interest to let whites think that they were, because whites assumed that they were plotting to have slave rebellions or run away or whatever. So my guess is that they did know each other. They were friends. They did what they could for each other. This is a community, but you didn't do it while whites were looking.
Yeah, and also, let's just look at how small a community it is. Henry Evans' mother and Henry lived on what's called Lot 6 in Hillsboro. 1 block away is Lot 19. That's where the Berrys lived. They lived 1 block from each other.
Interesting. Well, we have 2 final questions and then we'll wrap up for today. So I'm going to read this. Given the Evans brothers' connection by blood and marriage to the Copelands and Learys, it seems they had to have been radicalized by that association. Fannie Evans died in the early 1850s, and that cleared the brothers to leave. The Evans, Copeland, Leary families need much more research. Could it be that the Evans were members of the Underground Railroad?
In Ohio?
Yeah, so I'll hop in here if I might, just briefly. The house that the Evans brothers built in Oberlin is a National Historic Landmark. And it is cited as being a stop on the Underground Railroad. I think there's no doubt, and I appreciate that question, that John Copeland was the more radical and abolitionist member of that family, and probably led his uncle into a more radical position through their shared experience in the Oberlin-Wellington rescue. I don't know whether Reg has a comment about that or not.
No.
Any other comments on that one? Okay. Thinking about Job being confirmed at St. Matthew's, can you give us a sense of how common or uncommon this was in terms of the number of Black communicants there in those decades from the 1830s to the 1850s? Betty, I feel like that's you and Brooks on that one.
Okay, well, let me tell whoever asked that question to go on the Burwell School website and look at the task force report. And within that task force report, which is free and online, you just flip through it, is the parish record of the Black people that were baptized and confirmed at St. Matthew's during that period. And you can read all the names and count them up and see how many there are. I don't have that figure in my head.
I can definitely look that up and count it and send it out as well.
Okay.
Last, and then we'll wrap up. This has been so fantastic, and we've had just so much information. There is a comment. These two men were essentially urban slaves. Would there have been a completely different situation for plantation slaves?
I think one of the holes in our knowledge of Southern slavery is the fact that we know about slavery in Savannah, New Orleans, and Charleston. We know about the plantation slaves, but we know very little actually about little small town. I mean, Hillsboro was a village. It was a very, very small town. And one of the things that I'm most interested in is that Hillsboro provides the opportunity to really investigate what slavery was like in a very small town, and how it was different. It had to have been different than plantation slavery, had to have been different than Savannah slavery. But we just don't know much about it. So that's why I'm really interested in this issue. I would say the intimacy that is that is caused by having both whites, blacks, free blacks, Native Americans, mixed race, living in this very, very small space, provides some real opportunities to talk about what community life was like. The South had lots and lots of small towns and not many cities. So I think it's really important that we find out more about what small town life was like.
Right. And am I correct in saying that Hillsboro, around this time period, we're talking about around 700 people?
Yeah, between 500 and 700 people, but it's really hard to tell because the census doesn't designate town lines.
Right.
Meaning some of the most important white citizens of Hillsboro didn't live in what I would consider in town, within blocks of Churton Street. They lived outside in this ring of plantations or farms around Hillsboro. So it's really hard to tell what the exact population is.
But it's small.
But yes, it's very small.
It's very small. And if you look at the way property was owned by free blacks and by white people, and also where enslaved people live, you will notice that in Hillsboro, there are 7 creeks that go down to the Eno River. And by and large, the free black people owned the property along the river and up the creeks. And the white people owned the property on the hills of Hillsboro in between the creeks. And therefore, what you had was, because it's a small area, black and white living next door to each other. It was not the way Hillsboro is today, where you have basically a downtown historic district that's all white, with the black community living around the edges of that area. It was truly intermixed, and everybody truly knew each other. You had black barbers who cut hair for white people, but black people were not supposed to go to those barber shops. You had dentists who made a second office in their building so that they could have a black person working in that building with his business. And these advertisements in the Hillsboro Recorder are side by side. So there was a lot of what was going on in this small town was just because it was small and everybody knew each other. But it's really hard to tell the answers to these questions. As Sylvia said, people just didn't talk about it.
Can I just add to what what Betty and Sylvia have just said? Really insightful comments, both of them, and just underscoring it in terms of the relationship in a village as opposed to a city or a plantation, that both Evans and Berry could not have had the kind of business relationships they had, either as a painter or as a furniture maker, in a different kind of environment, because there they got to know people, interacted with people, and each of those business interactions adds to it a social interaction, that you get to know people and they get to know you. And so sort of the lines of demarcation that would take place in a larger city where there were unknowns and strangers, and the barriers and legal requirements had to be enforced for control and suppression and safety. Here, when people get to know each other and in and out of each other's homes and see each other over time and develop trust and respect, the lines become muted. And it's more possible for people to know each other and react to each other as people and not just as the categories that they represent. And things like John Wilson, and I'm sure everybody in town understood what that relationship was, and but everybody also understood there was no need to talk about it or to put it in a document. And we're struggling to find that out because in a village, those things did not have to be said, and they shouldn't have been written down, and they weren't.
Right.
I agree. Yeah.
My goodness. I have to say to the panel, thank you so much. This has been so interesting, so illuminating. I'm seeing comments come through on the Q&A and in the chat, just people thanking you for the work that you've done, for the time that you've put in, and for really highlighting these two men, and then what it might have been like for some of the others that we don't know about yet, that we still have to research and work on. And I think it's an exciting time to be part of a group of people who are willing to put in the effort and really start sharing these stories that have been lost, that weren't written down, that we have to dig a little bit deeper for. And that's what we really want to do. So thank you for this program. Thank you to all of our participants. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to send them our way. I can pass them along to our panelists if we didn't answer some of your things. Do follow us on Facebook, Instagram, all of those places so that you can find out about the other programs that we have. And just have a great rest of your weekend and keep in touch with us. We've got more and exciting things coming. So thanks to our panelists, and everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Carrie.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.